geographical placements is essentially a lottery. The placements of individuals and where they reside, these are particular things that aren't exactly controllable by even the people under opposition side. How government comes to this debate is to tell you a few things within setup. The first thing is to note how necessarily opposing the renewable equates to clean narrative necessarily looks like. Because note panel, the alternative coming from our side is always the presence of having renewable energy projects. It doesn't only just looks like solar or hydroelectric, it also looks like actually going for nuclear power energies, all of these particular things. What it also means then for you to go against these particular instances is for you to also then understand that there will be a lot more of actors actually opting into non-renewable particular projects simply because these are the particular things that are a lot more proximate for individuals to opt in. How does then this particular renewable energy narrative actually manifest under our side? The first thing to note is that there will be a shift of the importance of renewable energy within multiple discourse or multiple contexts of countries, right? But secondly, there's also a hierarchy of priorities or rights for these particular instances to be brought forth from these particular movements anyway, right? How we will be doing this under government side essentially is to understand at any point, for example, there is a harm towards the people on the ground or towards these particular, like forests, there will always be a compensation mechanism that likely would happen. So for example, if we take a particular habitat to build dams over these particular areas, we would have always been able to relocate these particular habitats, relocate these individuals or compensate them equally, which means because there's a priority to do this, there's also, for example, the importance to do so. So you have to buy the idea that these particular instances are very much likely, right? We also think then within framing as to how government will be coming in is to understand that the goal is always to go green anyway. This is something that opposition will have to buy in anyway, which means two important strategic thing comes out within our framing. The first thing is to note at the point in which you have a priority of hierarchy, which means to understand as an actor which should be the stepping stone first as an environment, as a state, or in general, right? But secondly, it also means that we put into consideration of the context of the states that are unable to, for example, make technological advancements that are valuable for these particular states anyway, which means at the point which there isn't a balance between states to be able to, for example, co-opt for these technological advancements, we recognize these particular instances, and that's why we agree with this particular narrative being something that is important. This is debate winning for three reasons. The first reason is because this is the only way that you're able to minimize the most harm, given the fact that you have a lot of scarcities within multiple contexts. But secondly, this is the most sustainable for actors to be able to act in and make a purpose within this particular issue, right? Two arguments I'm bringing for today. The first is why the renewable energy project is a necessity within multiple contexts. And secondly, give you an argument on why the trickle-down impact as to how we're able to shift from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. But before that, any clarifications? Great. So the first argument here is why the renewable energy project is something that is a necessity. Note in framing, firstly, that there is always a scarcity within resources or within the airtimes that necessarily movements have. But secondly, it also is important because the technological advancement that you have, if you buy in the idea that opposition would probably say this perfect form of renewable energy that doesn't have any form of harms, still requires the form of advancements to be there within the discussion, right? What's the problem within these particular things? Three things. The first is that most countries have a lot of struggles to actually be able to have this sufficient technology to make green technology, for example, to make solar systems that are able to actually, take in sunlight that isn't as much as, for example, cutting down these particular forests. But secondly, there's also a geographical lottery that exists, right? So for example, things like water, you need strong flows within a particular area of river. Things like, for example, wind. To build windmills, you need, for example, a strong area that has a lot of wind. Thirdly, in terms of sunlight, it happens within seasonal countries that aren't able to opt in. For example, in terms of nuclear, you need uranium to be able to be, taken in order for you to have this energy. For example, even just to have waves, you need coastal areas, which will also, at the end of the day, harm fishes. Anyway, what I'm proving here is that there will always be a form of trade-off that is necessarily needed to be taken in order to have these greater good. What's important within strategic conclusion here is that if opposition, best case assumes that there will always be a sustainable form of advancements, which is, by the way, very much unlikely, they have to prove this and make the comparative that we've given. You have to buy the idea that these harms would have still existed and would mean that even if they have their benefit, it happens in a very small scale because not a lot of countries are able to opt into these particular things. How do we solve this on the government side? The first is to understand how the narrative on our side manifests. I think it's important to note that specifically for the environmental movements as well, in order for you to be able to garner as much of attention and mobility, it means that you have to make it palatable or attractive for a lot of people to opt into renewable energy to begin with. So for example, things like corporations or even states, which happens in a scale, it's likely that they are willing to go for renewable energy that perhaps would harm a little bit of environment, but it comes to a greater good. But secondly, it also means that the endorsement from the movement is something something that is important. So note the priority of hierarchy that exists, right? So every second we do not spend on advocating for renewable energy, we are advocating for fossil fuel to be, taken down under their side, which means mobility happens better under our side. But there's third thing here in terms of investment for like advancement, right? We think this happens at a long run. So if you buy the idea under their side that perhaps you would have a form of advancement, we think we better co-opt that under our side because it's a lot more sustainable and it's a lot more easy for people to opt in. Weighing here is that this debate happens in a scale and it is a strategy. So at any point, for example, there's any form of like complacency from the movement or complacency from like any actors to begin with, there's a detrimental harm that happens for the environment. These are the particular instances that will still happen regardless. We'd rather take this particular trade-off early on to have a sustainable world. Second argument here is on trickle down, right? Note here that the shift from non-renewable to renewable energy is really important given the fact that there's always a scarcity or the form of like consciousness and awareness for the people of like every country, right? This also mechanizes the first argument that I gave, right? Why is it important? The first thing to know is within scale, right? Which means at any point, both teams would have tried to argue to you that we need to have as many states or as many actors to opt into these particular narratives that is good for the environment. So for example, countries with high carbon footprints, you need them necessarily to be attracted by the narrative in order for you to have a greater good and for the environment anyway. The strategy here is then for the environmental movement to mobilize the particular instances or narratives that already exist within status quo. So if we buy the idea that there's perhaps some form of awareness that people necessarily have about the environment, note that the renewable energy, like opting to renewable energy, like narrative or the information that they have necessarily is something that's important for us to mechanize. Because firstly, the ability for you to create valuable discourses, given the really little airtime that these environmental movements have, this becomes a really important tipping point in this debate. But secondly, the dependency on renewable energy is something that is important for a lot of the discussions that we'll have in this debate. Because things like electricity, oil, petrol, plastic, these are particular instances that aren't exactly accessible for people to opt in, which means at any point the movement tries to endorse for something that is meaningful, any point you try to argue something that is an alternative that is probably accessible to people and you go against particular instances, it's very hard for them to be able to opt in. Weighing here in terms of solvency, we bite the bullet, you might actually have to cut down trees, but we have a better sustainable world under government side. Thanks.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We now call on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Start my speech in 3, 2. Panel, in every action, there will always be a counter action or counter force working against it. It means, as so far what has happened in government world, there will always be a certain problem coming up due to renewable energy projects. They have considered early on regarding it, and we accept it totally. But then the problem here still stands, that as so far when you do regret the narrative that renewable energy isn't necessarily clean, it means that at the end of the day, you are incentivizing more people to undergo renewable energy projects that are necessarily harmful to society, to their local community, or to their livelihoods in general, which is generally harmful and something that should be taken care of, right? Because the problem here is that panel, the narrative only exists because a lot of those people are then directly affected by those renewable energy projects. It might look like how a dam being built might affect their livelihoods, might affect their towns, might affect their cities. And this is something that should not be regretted in general, because then it means that if we do regret this narrative, then you'll have more renewable energy projects that don't really have a good net positive in general. But before moving on, two key pieces of characterization, right? Then let's characterize what does the narrative actually look like in the opposition panel, because the problem here is that we, for the opposition side, we are not against renewable energy, right? Because we believe that renewable energy are not something that is entirely net positive. It means that there are plus sides to it, and because of it, there will be some sort of general improvement because of the conduction of those general projects, right? But then the problem here is that when you do regret the narrative, it means that there will be a lack of it means that under their side, it means that there will be less scrutiny towards renewable energy in the first place, right? And just because like something is good, it doesn't not, I'll take it for six. Just because it's good, it does not necessarily mean that it's entirely good. Hence why this narrative should not be regretted. Second of all, is then let's talk about the narrative under the Gulf side, right? Because panel here is that it means that under their side, there will be a lot more complacency when it comes to the issues of renewable. It means that local communities are then more likely to accept renewable energy projects, especially if it means that, oh, solar panels are good and we should cut down the forest and we should just destroy your livelihood and your community, right? Then it means that in their side of the house, more corporations can push things down the throats of communities solely because it is something that is marketed as good. And this is something that's generally harmful. Third categorization is left to look about how the nature or like the shape of renewable energy projects in general. Two piece key point of categorization, right? First of all, right, we have to admit that these projects are oftentimes expensive, they require a lot of time, and it means that they are more permanent in nature. As soon as you build solar panel by cutting down forest, it will stay there for a very long time. I'll take it for 6 later. And second of all, right, we have to admit that oftentimes a lot of those projects require localized efforts. It means that in the context of like local workers building renewable energy projects or the usage of local minerals, right, you might have to like take a look at the context of like building electric cars and so on and so forth. They require cobalt, they require rare earth elements and so on, right? And then you can also take a look at the usage of like locations such as a forest, dam, and certain areas, right? So what I'm trying to say here is because of those renewable energy projects being more localized, it means that you need a lot more local support in order for it to happen. And if you don't have those local support, then it means that a high chance those energy projects will not work in general. Now, moving on to the first argument is how regarding like the end doesn't justify the means and how like the narrative will eventually lead to a higher level of regulatory standard innovation. Panel, what is the framing for this, right? Panel, a lot of regulatory standards and like are the results of like continuous pressure from the local population or from the general society in general. It may look like how the government is pressured to have higher regulatory standard, or it may look like how environmental movement supporting certain actions, right? So it means that eventually, in order for you to have a higher regulatory standards, you will need to have the local population to be mobilized to express opinion, right? The narrative then ensures that we have a higher level of scrutiny among the population. First layer analysis is how does it work? It's split into two parts, right? Because first of all, is that the narrative actually mobilizes individual to stand up and to express the opinion. Because right, panel, the narrative is something that is generally mainstream. It means that it generally has the support of the individual or like the general population, because right in their mind, they have been told that renewables are not exactly clean. It is not something that is entirely net positive. You do have some sort of harm. And because of this, that they would tend to be more careful of certain renewable energy project that is happening in their local community. And because of it, they'll be scrutinized. I'll take it for 6, no worries, right? So then it means that, like if a certain project is harmful, then more people are then have a higher chance of mobilizing or being mobilized and to rise up and to express their opinions towards whatever renewable energy projects are happening. Second of all is how like narrative eventually shapes government policy or direction, right? Because panel, narratives are something that is necessarily strong, and when it is generally accepted by public, then it means that you're going to shape the policies of the government or like the environmental movement, right? So how does it look like from the government perspective, right? Because in our world, it means that the government is more incentivized to be more careful of renewable energy. And second of all, is that in our world, environmental movement tend to be more supportive of renewable projects that are safer and less sound. That to directly engage with their point here is that they kept telling us how there is like a hierarchy of needs and how there's a hierarchy of importance. We do admit that, but then it should not be at the cost of like the local community losing their livelihood or having their lives worse. Yes.
Your governments and corporations can always have the plausible argument to say that renewable projects are expensive and not worthwhile. How is it that under your side they can forward renewable energy projects?
Because in our side, we're going to still have renewable energy projects. It's just that the local government or like the local environmental or the local population will be more careful of it. Panel, to make it clear, right from the get-go, there will still be renewable energy projects in our place. There might be a reduction, like what the government might state, but it is something that we're willing to fight the bullet on, right? Because panel, first of all, when you do have renewable energy projects, it means that you're directly harming the life of those individuals or the livelihood. And this is something that is generally harmful, right? So panel, what does it mean in general? Because when you do have like more governments like being pressured to be more careful on energy projects, it means that you're going to get a direct more resources being shifted and how you have local support being amended, and there will be a higher level of political capital needed to push for certain things, right? And to directly a response to whatever their argument is regarding how there isn't any technological push on the outside, I'd like to argue that on the outside there will actually be more push to have gradual technology improvement, because those local community would then have a higher incentive to support whatever initiatives that will have more technological improvement, right? So then, what's to summarize the whole thing? Why is it important for us to have those narratives to mobilize things, right? It's very important because you're talking about the livelihoods. You're talking about societal harm. It means that people are losing jobs, or it means local community being destroyed just because some random guy wants to build renewable energy projects. So that's all for me for the books. Thank you.
I think the leader of opposition for that speech should now fall on the deputy prime minister.
So the burden in this debate is not whether this narrative is normatively true, in that it does create environmental harm. The way you ought to measure the value of this narrative is whether more people believing in it has been an effective way to deal with the certain secondary harms that they identify in this debate, and they've not yet proven from that speech why they would be. I have two rebuttals at the top of this speech, which I want to deal with very quickly. The first is that their side says that there is a tendency for renewable energy to be damaging. We reject that. And the reason why is because in the majority of cases, renewable energy will try to be as less environmentally damaging as possible to reduce the amount of harm. Why is this true? First, people who are already producing renewable energy are those who are already committed to protecting environment. That's why they chose to invest in solar instead of oil, even though oil might be more profitable, because there already is that internal endorsement of environmental values. But the second thing is that they concede from that speech that they get less environmental forms of renewable energy, but they never explain why that trade-off is fair. When on both sides of the debate, we want to get these more environmentally friendly renewable energies. So basically what the point here is that their side will have to trade off a massive amount of renewable energy because they want to create this idealistic version of that technology that is perfect. Second, their second argument is that you get more scrutiny to eventually make it better. We have two responses. One, we also can have discourse because we can say these are the types of renewable energy projects that are better. The burden they had to defend was an extremely high one of rejecting all forms of technology until they are perfect. Because it can't be a soft case, it's like we just want to highlight it. Because if you're only highlighting it without actually tangibly mobilizing resources to stop it from being implemented, now all of your harms are still symmetric, right? Because then they will also happen, you will still get the environmental harm. So you need a higher burden of rejecting it completely. Second, this argument on scrutiny depends on the discourse happening in a productive way. We reject that as well. We think majority of the way this discourse happens is people being able to strawman the movement and say, see, you also hypocritical, you also destroying the environment. So even if they get scrutiny, that scrutiny is actively unproductive and harms environmental goals. Three issues I want to discuss. The first one is that of the principle. Secondly, on the political strategy of the movement. And thirdly, why we get more renewable energy. First, on the principle, we accept that the environmental movement cares about this reduction of harm, but it doesn't care about the absolutist reduction of harm. It's about the comparative reduction of harm when we choose the lesser of two evils. Why is this true? We characterize the hierarchy of priorities from first that receives no response. Why is it true that the secondary harms of renewable energy are ultimately less significant than that of fossil fuels? The first is that in any form of energy generation, there is secondary harm. When you build an oil rig, you destroy ocean habitats. But when you build wave energy barriers to generate wave energy, you also destroy ocean habitats. The deadlock breaker is when you have more resource sustainability because you can continue to use the waves going back and forth, but you can't continue to use all of the harmful stuff when it comes to drilling oil into the earth because it's finite, it will eventually run out. That's why the harm is significantly less on our side, even if it does happen because it exists on both sides anyways. Number two, the very existence of fossil fuels is an active barrier to change. Shell and BP oil are political lobbies that fund campaigns of politicians in order to make sure that they are not broken up, that they are not regulated. They can continue environmentally harmful practices such as drilling and fracking. So removing big oil or making them divest away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy is of utmost priority. Because even if they get it on their side, we don't remove the power of big oil because it's harder for people to buy into environmental energies. So even if we accept environmental energies are bad, we think it's worse on your side. And with what we should do in the movement as a primary goal should be to get rid of fossil fuels ASAP, because environmental harm from the imperfect renewable energy is the lesser of two evils. So even if there are some things that the movement wants to avoid, we need to make certain compromises because being ideologically rigorous is impossible. If splintering happens on both sides, because some people like the narrative and some people don't like the narrative, this is the deadlock breaker. We get critical mass because more people are able to see why the thing is important, which is absolutely necessary to get voters to push for important policy change. Second, on the political strategy of the movement, we have three active harms that this narrative poses that they need to respond to in the second speech. First, it increases political ammunition against the environmental movement. When corporations and people against reform will use this to call out the environmental movement for hypocrisy, to say, well, it's not a huge benefit to the environment anyways, but it's a massive reduction in economic efficiency. Yes, they will do it on both sides and try to say you're hypocrites. The difference here is this: you give credence to the criticism of hypocrisy when the environmental movement itself is the one saying that the energy is something that is going to be bad. The difference is when the environmental movement says the energy is good, you can call it out for being hypocritical, or you can push back against the hypocrisy rather than feeding into it. Second, on their side, when you maintain this narrative, it creates internal tensions within the movement rather than unifying resources to actually push for more of these environmental energies to get put into the spotlight. You'll be constantly having this discourse and resources wasted on seeing whether it's good or not. Just a huge waste of time. We have to reprioritize resources productively. Third, there's a political backlash that the environmental movement is too demanding and unrealistic, that you only want this absolute version of things. So it becomes far easier for corporations to be like, we can't do that. It's very difficult. They can convince the public that look at that. It is difficult to do. Let's at least prioritize what we have right now with immediate guaranteed economic efficiency, keeping oil prices low, so it's harder for people to buy into the movement. The comparative on our side is we are more likely to endorse more forms of renewable energy. We can get it off the ground faster and finally dethrone fossil fuels before that point. Okay, sure. Third issue, why we get more efficient renewable energy. This takes them at their absolute best grounds. Maybe their side is effective in proving that they can eventually get this form of perfect environmental technology. Why is this still bad? Their form of energy is less efficient. For instance, when uranium is obtained through seawater filtration, rather than directly mining underground uranium deposits, studies have shown that this form of nuclear fission generates less efficient energy generation, which means that even if you accept their best case, all forms of energy on their side are very inefficient. And the impact of this is, first, you get more backlash. People say, look, we trusted you the transition would be efficient, but the energy generation you get is very weak. So people are less likely to trust the environmental movement in the future, even if you achieve their immediate first impact of better technology now. But second, it just means that energy is pretty important. We have a growing population, we have more industries leading here. So this is bad when more people are suffering because they trusted the movement on your side, you betrayed them. What's the comparative on our side? The environmental movement can fight back against narratives that aim to stigmatize nuclear energy. We can reclaim it as an energy source that is effective when nuclear energy has been incredibly important to countries being able to generate huge amounts of power from just a small nuclear power plant, which means it's a far more efficient form of renewable energy. And this is important because efficiency tells the people in power that, look, renewable energies can also be efficient. It's not just oil that's efficient. So we remove the greatest argument that people use against renewable energy. So on our side, we get far more renewable energy quickly, and we reduce the worst of two evils. For all these reasons, you have to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We now call the Deputy Leader.
Sustainable future should be defined as something the future generation should have not experienced what the current generation have. Something that technological government wouldn't even manifest at the end of the day. But before that, few responses to the speaker before me. First, let's disbuild the case. Firstly, there's no nuance with the status quo because government can only hide with their brave bullet of not cutting down the trees, and we don't think that's something charitable, and like we can also do that, right? Secondly, is we believe that no support is equivalent to intruder, because like my LO says now, if you don't have support and you don't have agreement with the local people, it will become intrusive because it requires consensus of the people who are the affected areas. And thirdly, and even though there is a form of like compensation and mechanism and whatnot, we don't think that like that is enough to replace the area that these indigenous people have built upon their life. And these people are like building something that is far more like renewable in comparison of their world, right? And like lastly, let's deal with how the government would like, even if it's true, but the government would like, it means that the government will like recover slower because of their form of like because of form of transition. Because my LO said that we would like under our side we're more careful in dealing in dealing with this kind of thing, that at the end of the day we would like at the best we would like minimize the secondary harm under our world. And but before that, before that, let's move on to the first argumentation of oppositions. Firstly, is that negative impacts on the renewable energy industries and perceptions. The framing goes that doing something bad to achieve something good cancels out the good, right? So first level of analysis deals with the exploitation of human rights to make a so-called renewable innovations. But under our rule, people are forced to work, and exploitative nature of it leads to, for example, like mining cobalt. People are being taken advantage of their labor works, and this actually violates the rights of works in South Africa and Congo. They are being taken away their rights, and to make the electric cars that are being used by the rich people. How then is this celebration of this renewable energy is manifested on their side? Because violation of human rights and the labor works happens out under our side, and this cancels out the good of everything they want to prove. And secondly is that in terms of indigenous people, they are going to lose their lands, and there will be the displacements of the people would happen. Even though there's form of mechanism, but I've already put to you in terms of how it's not enough, but sure.
You're being uncharitable. These individuals would have still been affected by climate change anyway. How do you make people transition to renewable energy? That's something you've never.
But we don't think how your form of compensation mechanism is also going to benefit them at the end of the day. And with a secular level of analysis in terms of how these violations and exploitations will only lead to less buy-in and for people and in terms of narratives. Firstly, on how they will like less trust of credibility and among these people, because once you lose trust because of their abusive power and they are being unethical, which means that the government would, which means that consumers and investors and their side will be more skeptical into the buy-ins into the renewable energy, and we don't think that, and this is something that only like happens on our side. And third level of analysis on how the renewable actually unequals to clean narrative actually true, because we don't think that the whole point of our case is just to prove that the end does not justify the means, and doesn't mean something is like good is that you need to pursue it. And the conclusion and the strategic conclusion is that like no matter what means used to justify renewable energy, you need under our side at least we will still minimize harm, but under their side they are like going to make they are going to make a sustainable future, but they're going to harm the current generation. We don't think that the current generation need to deal with whatever the renewable energy policy that they are going put forth in, and we don't think that our generation should like experience what to make a better for generations. And this is what the comparative under our side, and this is something not like happen on their side. And the conclusion is like I've already proved to you in terms of how their mechanism, the compensation mechanism at the best is insufficient, and I've already proved to you in terms of argumentations of how the negative impacts would affect the industry and perceptions and would make people to less buy-ins. And with that,
very uncomparative. Because even when they say that we need renewable energy and that we need all the technological advancement, but at the same breath, they did not have any form of analysis to prove how likely is that they will get on the their side of the house. It was clear from government bench that the angle which we entered this debate was to prove that it was a lesser of two evils, considering that it's a narrative debate where we are competing upon finite resources and finite airtime in terms of how the environmental movement can get critical mass to ensure that we can push forward some form of sustainable renewable projects on the outside of the house. The other side of the house was to suggest that it is a displacement of people and therefore it is bad. But we told you from the very beginning, there's no end for these people. We can mitigate those harms also on the other side of the house, where we say that if people do get displaced and their inherent attachment to those lands, because by purely of them being indigenous, it is a worthy trade-off because it's a matter of urgency. For example, even if you might live there and your land is still there, you might die from climate change, soil erosion, flash floods, increasing amounts of temperature. All of this urgency makes it a worthy trade-off, and as to why the environmental movement should have a stance within these two things. The first thing, before I go on to a few points of issues, I'd like to point out two strategic failures of opposition. The first is their inability to explain the trend of behaviors in status quo, because their unwillingness to engage with our side is the downfall of their case, because they say that in status quo, the comparative is that you won't get people to care about renewable energy, or even if people care about renewable energy, there is a facade of it being the best version possible, even though we already said from the very get-go it's not true. What is the core tenet of the environmental movement and environmentalists in general? The first thing, there is an overarching emphasis for things, for example, minimizing environmental degradations. So things, for example, if we could have prevented, for example, displacement of people, prevented the destruction of habitats, prevented, for example, soil erosion and things like that, we could have done that to begin with. The debate happens in a way whereby it happens in a more reasonable basis where we need to compromise on certain aspects. Their ideological purity will be the end of the environmental movement, purely because the fact they even couldn't explain how they can get bills passes under their side of the house, because purely their geographical lottery, when things, for example, it's inevitable for certain places to not get harmed, or things, for example, indigenous community to not be displaced. All this inevitable means by purely of geographical lottery or geographical locations, as explained by Prime Minister, was unrebutted by the side of opposition. They needed to engage to that end. But secondly also, how will they get the most technologically advanced form of renewable energy? And this is assuming the best case of opposition. Assuming, for example, they can get 100% not at all harms to environment, what will happen under their side of the house? In number one, companies can always have the plausible dynamic to say that we can't do this because it's too expensive. But number two, there is a lack of political awareness, even under your side, which you guys conceded, that there is no awareness for things, for example, renewable energy. And because of the urgency in status quo, for example, if you do not invest in renewable projects, it is the exact same expense that we see in status quo, where more money oil and gas companies will pump into to non-renewable energy, for example, oil and gas and fossil fuel companies. That is the comparative that they needed to engage with. So firstly, are the harms posed by opposition mitigatory? Things, for example, displacing people and harming the environment. We told exactly from first, compensation can happen through relocation, or we can plant more trees. But secondly, we would say the debate is about maintaining, minimizing harm and the balancing the cost and benefit analysis of states. The first thing I would look into is that what the incentive of state actors under both sides of the house. The first thing is that we analyze is that state under our side of the house are more likely to get bills passed because the inherent incentive in environmental movement is to endorse renewable projects, even when we choose the lesser of two evils. Yes, we say there is some form of compromisation, but ideological purity under their side won't have any forms of bill passed under their side of the house. But secondly, also, companies under their side of the house will always have the plausible deniability to say that things are expensive in status quo and therefore would not put in money to renewable projects under status quo. But lastly, societal discourse. And this was their biggest bet, because they say in our world, what happens is that there will be less scrutiny on renewable projects. This is why I would like to deconstruct the narrative of how society view renewable projects. Their contingency plan was to suggest that if we have this overarching narrative on our side, if we don't propose it, is that people will look as a facade. That's not true, because what is dependent on the fact of whether or not we care about environmental harms, it depends on whether or not we are environmentalists to begin with. And being an environmentalist means that the core tenet of you as a person is that you always want to minimize environmental degradation, environmental harm. On both sides of the house, it is not dependent on whether or not this narrative would succeed. What is the tipping factor here? Making people understand better that it is not ideological purity per se, considering we are fighting with oil and gas companies having finite resources and finite items. The unique benefit that we can get under our side is having that critical mass. And because you have this core tenet, for example, minimizing environmental degradation, this can then be a stepping stone on how we can get perhaps more technological advancement under our side as well. So the thing of having more technological scrutiny or technological advancement on the side of opposition can always be co-opted because the inherent natural incentive of companies and state actors is to always minimize environmental degradation anyways on both sides of the house. Yeah, BY? No, okay, sure. Second, second thing I'll look into is the unique beneficial outcome from this narrative. Their biggest claim from DLO was to suggest that, number one, if we don't have, was to suggest that under their side of the house, because of the fact that people have like this technological, because of the fact people have this like attachment to this land and therefore it's bad if we displace it. This is where I would like to break out the balance of rights, because I think they didn't really clear out how we balance rights in status quo. The first thing is that the unique beneficial outcome from this narrative is we get economic efficiency. And that's really clear from Umar's and Sarah's speech. The way we get economic efficiency is that when you have renewable projects and being endorsed by environmental movement means that you get more funding for people to pay for renewable energy. And the overarching discourse and the way in which we pass these projects is really important, because in status quo, there is a trend to always have pit fighting. People always like put people like fighting against each other, like non-renewable energy versus renewable energy. The environmental movement in status quo needs to be strategic and hinge their bets on renewable outcomes, renewable energy projects. And it's unique under our side of the house, because the versions of the most perfect form of renewable energy from opposition is something that we don't know until now, because they haven't characterized how this 100% no damage on environmental outcomes project looks like under their side of the house. But secondly, their best case scenario is that they get less economic efficiency, because all these things, for example, like the argument about uranium like mining through sea filtration is like really, really hard, and it's better to just mine on uranium. Is really important. Those efficiencies are really unique under our side, and it's something they don't get from the side of opposition. So proud to propose.
While we're waiting for that speech, we now call on the opposition. Here.
About the burden that government comes and tells us that we have to give, right? Because I think it's completely uncharitable that they push this burden on us. Because even in the motion itself, right, the only burden that opposition has here in this debate is to prove that that taking the narrative that renewable doesn't equal clean benefits the renewable energy industry and its movement further in the first place. Our burden is not to prove that that we need to reject it all. Our burden is only to prove that when we concede to the fact that renewables are not perfect, that renewables don't equal this perfect world, it means that we can further the renewable movement in the first place. So then, moving on to a few points coming in from government, right? Because they first they say that because in a world where you say, hey, it's still good when a village is being bulldozed down, you sink to the lows of those actual fossil fuel industries. So then government says that there will be a compensation then in their world, because the hierarchy of priorities means that like there will be compensation for these people, right? But I fail to see that just because there will be compensation, I fail to see how it will be fair, because they don't tell us how it will be fair. But just because let's see status quo, right? Fossil fuel industries will be doing the same things as these as what the government wants to do, right? They bulldoze down villages because they want to make these like oil fields.
They don't tell you what the incentive is in government as to how this compensation will be fair or as to how this compensation will even like benefit people.
So there's a so you want a form of renewable energy that doesn't require any bulldozing at all. How likely are you able to get that? And is this something that most countries around the world can adopt?
I think we're likely to get that because in the world where we say that this is going to be happening, it means that we accept that fact and we say that we want it to be better. So in the world where you accept the fact, it means that you are more likely to find options as to how not to do that. In your world, you're more likely to be complacent on the fact that that will happen because you just say, oh, it's just a part of it, instead of saying that, oh, we need to change this because it is a part of it. So then moving on is to what government has said. They say that we understand.
So that assertion might occur, but that has to be compared with what we say in terms of what is the core principle and core tenet of the environmentalists and environmental movement. Counteract that for possible assertion.
I'll deal with that in a bit. We understand the hierarchy of importance requires for there to be a stepping stone, right? In your world, that's what you want, right? For the environmental movement, for this renewable energy movement to be your current movement to be a stepping stone. But I tell you that at the point where you say you get innovation, I think you lose this debate because at the point where you don't agree that there are problems with status quo in fear of the movement being set back, you set back the movement in itself. Because when you let cut faster without addressing it, it gets infected and it spreads. So at the point where you don't agree that there is going to be some problem, there are problems with the movement, it means that in the future, people are going to say, look, you're just the same as these fossil fuel companies. Because at the point where you are creating harm, it means at the point where you are creating harm and you don't address that harm, it means that you don't get innovation because people don't, because you don't address the harm in itself. Because when you don't address harm, then what is the need for innovation in a government's world, right? So then moving on into what DPM has said, right? Because DPM says that scrutiny harms the movement. I want to say that this happens in both narratives, but in your narrative, this is worse because if you don't accept that scrutiny, if you don't address that scrutiny, then it just damages the movement further. It just means that people are more likely to not buy into the movement because when you don't address those, like when you don't address the bad, it means that people are more likely to say, hey, they're not addressing the bad, so aren't they just as bad as like these fossil fuels? Why should we buy into this movement? Even if they do give some good, it is more costly in their world. So then if they're not addressing what the costs are doing to the people, like this high cost is taking from the people, it means that they're just perpetuating the harms of the fossil fuel industry, right? So moving on into why they say our narrative is still bad. They say it takes too long and it's less efficient, and there's going to be more backlash from politicians because it's less inefficient. Yes, we agree to that. We agree to the point where we say, like, currently, yes, I agree, it is less inefficient for us to like have an ideological world where renewables are like perfect. But we don't want the world right now where we want renewables to be perfect. We want a world right now where people agree that they are imperfect in itself. Because at the point where you can agree to that, it means that there will be some innovation that will happen. There will be some innovation that will happen so that it becomes more efficient. We can agree to the fact that it is less efficient, but just because it is less efficient doesn't mean that you can't strive towards a world where you want more efficiency and the perfect world. So in your world, you don't get that because in your world, yeah, sure, there will be more buy-in to this. So let's take government's best case, right? Because their best case will probably be that there will be more buy-in into this into the movement, and I think that's a good thing. But why is it still bad then, right? Because I tell you that at the point where you get so much buy-in, but you don't address the harms of what is happening, it means that at that point, people will come up and say, hey, there are harms to this, but you're not telling us the harms and you're not addressing the harms. So then why are you not just as bad as the fossil fuel industry? So at that point, it means that you degrade the movement in itself in the first place. So at that point, it means that people are less likely to even continue with the buying in on their countermeasure, right? So then with that, I end.
Think the opposition argument for that speech we now call on the opposition. Here.
Speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate is one that is very confusing, and it's a debate where the government side has been very uncharitable and very unfair towards opposition side, right? Because every single sector that the government speaks up or like talks in their speeches, they are trying to push us. They're trying to, accuse the opposition of like ideological purity and supporting on non-renewable energy, while at the same time trying to push burden to us that are unfair in general. Three things first, right? They kept telling to us about how under the opposition side, we will generally only support renewable energy that is perfect, where there is no harm towards the social or like the local community in general. Second of all, is that they told us that solely because like we accept the narrative under the opposite side, it means that there'll be more oil fields to be built, or there'll be like no more push towards like non-renewable energy projects. And that is how they say that under their side, there'll be like adequate compensation mechanism, which is generally untrue because it was not mechanized whatsoever, right? Because it is already in the status quo. So then let's have a idea of what happened so far and what the opposition side have established in the 4 things first. Panel is that we already established to all of you that the narrative is something that is mainstream, and because of it, a lot of people support it. Second of all, we already established that the renewable energy projects are totally reliant on local support, and then if the locals don't really support the energy project, then it means that it will not necessarily happen. Third is that we already established that technology advancements will then be guaranteed under our side as a total response towards the government, right? So then, like, what is then the angle for the opposition here? Like let's re-clarify things, right? Because panel, our angle here is that we're saying that those narratives give scrutiny to any and all renewable energy projects. It means that those scrutiny is something that is very important. Right from the LO, DLO, and to my opposition group, we have been telling you that those scrutiny is important because it means that you're going to keep the renewable energy projects in check. It means that under our work, there will be less societal harm, there will be less harm towards the livelihood. And we have been telling you, and we have way right from the opposition group, that at the case, at least under our side, when you have more scrutiny, it means that there will be more technological improvement, and this is something that we have totally answered as compared to the government, right? So then let's take a look at the cases of the government, because they keep telling us about how if we do reject the narrative, or like if the opposition wins this vote, it means that we're going to increase political ammunition against the environment, and how like at the end of the day, it means that we're going to increase the amount of non-renewable energy projects, which is totally untrue. Because panel, right from the get-go, we've been telling you that we don't really want a perfect form of renewable energy policy. We admit that renewable energy projects are something that is not really perfect. And we want to make it perfect, but then there needs to be some sort of scrutiny. And hence why those scrutiny is something that is good, and it will eventually like propel more technological advancement that will make it perfect one day. So then, like, to summarize my reply speech, the only push that we're going to go for the opposition here is that we believe that renewable energy projects, they are indeed harmful, and in certain cases they have a lot of social harms, and those social harms must be addressed in the first place. And the only way for you to address those social harms is when you have scrutiny from the local community leaders, and we have scrutiny from the environmental movements, and this is something that is not generally taken off the government. Because the government, as so far from the first to third speaker, they kept saying to us how if the motion is rejected, it means that there will be like more non-renewable energy projects, and like BP or like Shell will like invest more money in like oil fields, which is generally untrue. Hence why I'm proud to oppose. Thank you. Oppose. Thank you.
I think the opposition reply for that speech then is the date we now call on the government. Here.
So this is going to be extraordinarily simple. I'm going to give you the weighing metrics you ought to judge this debate by, and why we win all 3. Number 1, we were more comparative. We accept that our strategy on government does create some level of secondary social harm. But that alone was not enough for them to win, because we can assert and counter-assert harms all day long. What we needed was an explanation for why one of these harms were more important than the other. We provided two pieces of weighing for why the nuance of our case means we get less harm, and thus the environmental movement should choose it. The first is that the immediate removal of fossil fuels and big oil, by virtue of us being more persuasive in getting renewable energies onto the market, is the most important thing in the debate, because they are actively destructive, actively lobby against other forms of renewable change. So this is the prerequisite to making all of the forms of impacts that they want to have. Second, it's easier to mitigate the problems that we face, because as they say, we can make this technology better over time. We can still deal with the secondary social harms like educating people and so on, but they aren't able to deal with all of the harms of the climate becoming worse when we continue to store and wait, and that leads to more fossil fuels existing. Which means why, if both sides have some harm, our harm was at least less. Number two, we were more dynamic, because this team hinged their case on a very narrow and rigid pathway to victory. We identify the problems of this energy, we have discourse and scrutiny, and eventually we perfect it. We proved this was weak and insufficient for three reasons. One, that sometimes the problem is not the technology itself, but it's a necessary byproduct of the method of this energy generation. That if you have wave energy, you can't create the perfect technology that doesn't destroy oceanic habitats, because you still need to build something by the coastline. If you have wind energy, you can't have a perfect wind turbine that doesn't destroy the environment, because you need to build it in a mountainous, windy region. But number two, they never proved how this discourse and scrutiny will be effective. Why would it actually lead to resources being spent well? Why would it not be overshadowed by other groups using this as political ammunition to call the movement hypocritical, as we push from all three speakers to no response? Which is why even if you believe that it could happen, they never proved why it would happen. Thirdly, even if this wasn't true, we explain why the process of making it better wasn't exclusive to their side, because the people committed to renewable energy already care about reducing environmental harm, already are those who prioritize environmental protection, came from second and third to no response. So we prove why the worst case is still beneficial, and in a dynamic range of cases. At least our technology and our form of renewable energy was more efficient, because even if they get it perfect with purity, it is still one that's likely to be worse in terms of efficiency, and this draws way more blowback from society at large, which harms the movement in the future, even if they get their initial benefits. Number three, we were more engaging, because we engaged with their issues and justified why our metrics were the more important ones in the debate. We proved why ideological perfection came at the trade-off of buy-in, making it far harder for people to see why environmental when it comes to renewable energy being something that's feasible, something that they can opt into that's efficient and inexpensive. And that was bad, because when they don't get this buy-in, they don't have the critical mass that is needed for all of their policies to pass in the future. Number two, we proved why this trade-off was crucial because of the hierarchy of priorities, that if something needs to be compromised on anyway, we explain why this secondary social harm is the one we are more willing to accept on our side, which is why our metrics are correct. What were our independent benefits in this debate? The first is that we get far more renewable energies when we don't cause splintering and a misprioritization of resources, where we can pool together resources to endorse renewable energies, to prove that these are the good things that you have, rather than internally fighting and deciding which is bad, which is good. This is important, because in the interim period on their side, every second spent waiting to make renewables perfect is a second spent on fossil fuels being burned and destroying the earth. On their side, their push for perfection meant that more people suffer in the interim, and that was why we are so proud.
I think the for that speech that has